this week, of course, I'm going to be talking about mostly the end of the 50s. I'll talk about the Eisenhower era, which I'll show you a little video on. I'm going to get into the 60s. I should be able to get close to that today, at least maybe start talking about Kennedy a little bit, the Kennedy administration. And probably later I'll be getting into the Lyndon B Johnson administration maybe as well. So getting to the 60s pretty much this week. I don't know what we're going to get the rest of the semester, like next week and the week after that, but I'll try to cover in the 70s and 80s and whatever I can get in after that. I don't think we'll cover everything, but I'll try to get as much as I can because we did lose a week during the semester because of the hurricane season and all that. All right. So anyway, of course, I'm going to go ahead and move on. We're going to, of course, go back and, of course, talk about I think we're getting into, we've pretty much done the Truman period at the beginning of the Cold War, more or less. I'm getting into next talking about the Eisenhower period, which I'll get to next. And I told you that, well, I didn't get into it yet, but Truman didn't run for re-election in 1952. In fact, he was the last guy that could have served an extra term there, basically had more than eight years. They had the 22nd Amendment, which, limits a president for only serving 2 terms, basically 8 years. But he declined to run. So he didn't want to run for president. So that left kind of an opening at that point, more or less. And so into that void, as you know, you saw in the video, you had Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped in to run for president. Of course, the famous, American general that helped win D-Day in the World War II. He was one of the head of the Supreme Allied Expeditionary Force that basically defeated the Germans in Europe. And Eisenhower ran as a Republican, and he campaigned on a slogan, which was, "It's time for a change." And so eventually chose, you can see there, Richard Nixon, who would later be president of the United States as well, from California. He eventually became his vice presidential running mate, and Nixon will be vice president of the United States for 8 years too as well. Eisenhower, of course, came up with a great slogan, which you saw in the little short video. That was "I like Ike." Ike, remember, was his nickname, if you know about that. That became a real famous, popular slogan that they used, and it helped propel him to victory in this particular election. I think I've got a picture of showing him campaigning in "I like Ike." Ike is for us. We like Ike. That became pretty much a slogan, pretty much. And so anyway, that's how he basically got elected. Who did he run against? By the way, we put that back on the screen for you. But who did he run against? He ran against Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson was a governor of Illinois who ran in 1952, 1956. I think he ran in 1962. Ran for president 3 times, I know of. Adlai Stevenson. He lost twice to Eisenhower. He lost in 1952. He lost in 1956. And Stevenson will later go on to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under John F. Kennedy. So I'll talk about him later. He's kind of gets involved in kind of an incident with that too, which kind of interesting later, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll probably talk about that later, which is kind of very interesting. Not now, but I'll get to it later. Now, Eisenhower won a landslide. Like I said, Adlai Stevenson didn't do well. Eisenhower got 442 electoral votes, and of course, Stevenson got 83. And he lost again, like I said, in 1956 as well. What were some things that Eisenhower did during his administration? Well, I talked about that already. He's the one that got the Koreans to basically end the Korean War. He got them to sign an armistice, like a ceasefire, to basically end the war, which was in 1953. That was like one of his first things that he did really as president. And eventually what happened was North and South Korea were, divided again at the 38th parallel. And what happened was both sides set up a demilitarized zone between them, which still exists today. However, the war never officially ended. You know about the Korean War. They never signed a treaty. And so therefore, in a sense, they're kind of still at war. They've kind of, in the last couple of years, they've tried to kind of amend things a little bit, but they're still kind of, don't like each other. Now, foreign policy wise, one of the big things that Eisenhower did was they kind of changed the policy against communism. They tried to get more, tougher on communism. And the Secretary of State, the new one under Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, came up with the new policy to counter communism. Because, under Truman, they were trying to just prevent it from spreading. Dulles came up with this idea of what is called brinkmanship, is what they called it. And it was the idea that the United States would use the threat of nuclear war to basically prevent nuclear war against the Soviet Union. That sounds crazy, but basically that's what they did. What we did, the United States, during the Cold War. And so we basically began stockpiling nuclear weapons starting in the 50s, which we did pretty much up to, I think at least up to the 1980s, 89 or whatever, pretty much did that during most of the Cold War, era. And you have to understand that basically the threat of nuclear war is what, prevented nuclear war itself. It's kind of ridiculous and all that. And later on, they referred that to as being called mutual assured destruction. You ever heard about that before? It's this idea that basically if both sides were to go to war, the whole world would be destroyed. So more or less, that was the reason how we were able to kind of avoid World War III by basically the threat of it itself. Now, I need to also talk about Nikita Khrushchev. He, of course, became the ruler of the Soviet Union during the 1950s. There he is right there, Nikita Khrushchev. And what happened was in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin died in 1953. And so he was eventually replaced by this new leader. A lot of people thought he was going to be like Stalin, kind of a hardliner and all that. But at that point, what happened was he gave this secret speech in Russia that was called I think it was called Khrushchev's secret speech. I think 1956, I think it was. And he denounced a lot of Stalin's policies, like his cult of personality and all that. And he began what is called De-Stalinization. What was De-Stalinization? De-Stalinization was a series of policies that they started the Soviet Union, which were associated with various political reforms. They also eliminated, like I said, Stalin's cult of personality that was around him as a person. They ended the Gulag system. What was that? The Gulag system was this forced labor camp system that they had in the Soviet Union, where they put a lot of people there and they used them as kind of like prison labor. And so they were trying to get more openness with everybody, like with the West and all that. And that's something that Khrushchev tried to do, like in the late 50s and all that. The only thing is, though, was that America, we thought that, that would happen, that, in Eastern Europe, they would start loosening a grip on Eastern Europe, giving them more rights and all that, democracy, free elections. That proved to be kind of wrong in some places, especially in Hungary. I know that. Although in Poland, they kind of gave some rights for a while. I know that, not that much, but they did. Like in Poland, they elected a Polish nationalist to the Communist Party. That was something they kind of knew they did at that time. And he began promising all these rights that, that Khrushchev was kind of trying to do with this, de-Stalinization and all that. You can get freedom of religion, which is kind of surprising with that one, because Soviets kind of tried to stop that. And believe it or not, Khrushchev decided to actually give them some rights, a little bit anyway, with that point. However, what happened was, for some reason, with this being kind of encouraging about Poland getting, more rights at that point, Hungary thought the same thing. Hey, we ought to try this too, get more rights. And so what happened was in October of 1956, you had the Hungarian Revolution break out, where mostly started by college students, believe it or not, universities in Budapest, Hungary. They started rebelling against the whole Stalinist regime that was, there before, and they demanded all these new freedoms that like Poland is kind of getting at that point overall. And so it led to this Hungarian Revolution, which would go on from like October to November. Few days, what happened was Soviet army was overwhelmed by all these so-called freedom fighters that tried to, fight them. And within like 8 days, the Soviets actually had to withdraw their forces from Hungary. So it looked like they were going to, get all these freedoms, pretty much at that point. But Khrushchev realized that if they don't do something about this, this would have spread to all those Warsaw Pact countries at that point overall. And so what happened was, as you know, if you know about this, the Soviets then sent their forces back into Hungary. And within a few days, like 5 or 6 days or so, they crushed the Hungarian Revolution. Somewhere around 3,000 or so Hungarians were killed trying to fight like Soviet tanks and all of that. And a lot of them were actually imprisoned, like they were sent back to the Soviet Union in prison. And I think the guy that was the prime minister of Hungary, Emir Nagy, was actually imprisoned and executed by him because he had been involved in actually being a leader of the Hungarian Revolution and all of that. What's interesting is when all this was all going on, they tried to get help from us. They kept asking us, Americans, can you help us out? I think they were on the radio trying to tell us, radio airways, asked if we could send military aid to help them, but we couldn't do anything about it because I think if we would have sent forces in there, it would have been basically World War III is what would have happened. So that really, was one conflict that he had. World War III almost broke out a couple times under him, Eisenhower, and later under Kennedy as well. Then they had the, if you go up here, they had also what they call the Suez Crisis. Let me go down here. I don't think it's right here. Where is it? I'll come back to that later. But they had the Suez Crisis that they had as well. That was another thing that basically was a famous conflict that occurred as well. The Suez Crisis. And what was that? The Suez Crisis was where what happened was in Egypt, the Republic of Egypt, they actually nationalized the Suez Canal, which I think at that point had been controlled by like powers like France and Britain. And so the Republic of Egypt under President Gamal Nasser decided to do this. And it angered France, Britain, and also Israel, the state of Israel. And so they basically decided to send their forces in there to take care of it. They seized control of the actual Sinai Peninsula, including the actual Suez Canal. And so that made basically Nasser realize that the West wasn't really friendly to him. And so a lot of these Middle Eastern countries start really trying to get help from the Soviets. And so that's kind of important because the Cold War era, if you study about like all these Middle Eastern conflicts they have, like the Arab-Israeli wars and all that, were kind of like parts of the Cold War. They're kind of like these proxy wars that they were having. And so that's something that kind of happened, because of that. And around a 2-day period, they had seized control of the canal, Britain, France, and Israel. And the Soviet Union at that point threatened nuclear war, like World War III, if they didn't remove all their forces at that point. And Eisenhower, who didn't really know anything about this military operation, got really angry about it and forced basically Britain, France, and Israel to basically withdraw their forces. And the UN helped them like intervene, and they had a resolution that basically forced them to withdraw. So that was kind of a conflict which really could have caused World War III. And they believe that the Suez Crisis later developed, of course. It forced Eisenhower to create a new doctrine that was called the Eisenhower Doctrine, which you may have heard about. And the Eisenhower Doctrine was where it would allow basically the President of the United States to use military force, like to intervene in the Middle East if a Middle Eastern country needed help, like say from checking like communist aggression or whatever, as an example. And so that's basically what that was. And so it led to the United States giving something like $200 million in military aid to a lot of Middle Eastern countries. So you got this case where, some countries are being backed by the U.S. and some are being backed by the Soviet Union. And it's kind of all, like I said, part of the Cold War era, at that time. So anyway, that's kind of some stuff that happened under Ike that was, Eisenhower, that was kind of famous at the time, more or less. Now, there's another thing I wanted to talk about, which is something that kind of starts under Eisenhower's administration that's well known. Of course, in 1957, they had what they call Sputnik that happened. You may have heard about this story. Of course, the Americans were very shocked about this. Sputnik. And Sputnik was, of course, if you know about it, first launching of a first satellite, which was done by the Soviet Union in October of 1957. It scared the hell out of us. And of course, you could hear that beeping sound as the satellite went around the Earth. And people realized that the Russians could launch these things into space with rockets, and that could be like not just a satellite, but a nuclear bomb. That they could do. So it's something that's important, the Sputnik. And Sputnik, is what started the space race that would occur later between the United States and the USSR throughout the 1960s and 70s and all that. And in fact, the Soviets went on to even put a man on the moon. Put a man in space, which was Yuri Gagarin was the first man to go into space, which was in 1961. Soviet astronaut, or they call them cosmonauts. So because of Sputnik and all of that, the Eisenhower administration created NASA, as you know, the National Aeronautics Space Administration, 1958, which is later based in mostly Florida, also Texas and all that. And so we would use NASA to begin launching like satellites and men into space and all of that. And we launched our first satellite into space in January of 1958, which was Explorer 1. It's called. And Explorer 1 would, of course, later lead to, the launching of other satellites. And then after that, that led to the Mercury 7 program, which the Mercury 7 program was where we developed the first astronauts that were, of course, launched into space from what is Florida. Which our goal later will be to put a man on the moon, which Kennedy talks about later when he comes in as president in the 1960s overall. The first men, by the way, in the space, if you want to know, for the Americans, were Alan Shepard. He was the first man, American astronaut to go into space in 1961. He did not orbit, though. He just went into space and came down. And John Glenn, you may have heard of him, he's later an American senator, was actually the first American to actually orbit the Earth going around, which was in 1962. And then, of course, later they'll have other programs you may have heard of, like the Gemini program in the 60s. They had, of course, the Apollo program, late 60s and 70s. The Apollo program would be the one, that they put men on the moon, of course, later. So kind of just talking about the space race and all that. Let me go ahead and, of course, move on. I'll spend a few minutes reviewing what we've done so far. And then I should have time to kind of move on, talk about a few other things today. So Cold War begins. That, of course, occurred under the Harry Truman era, which starts in basically after World War II. What was the Cold War? The Cold War era was this geopolitical struggle between the Soviet Union, the United States, and their allies, which were the two big superpowers after the war. It involved, of course, the threat of nuclear war between both sides called the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. The United Nations was a international intergovernment peace organization that was established in 1945. It was later, of course, headquarters in New York City. It included the UN Security Council, which was the main apparatus that ran it. It includes basically the big five that were on it, which were the United States, Britain, France, China, and Russia. Of course, Soviet Union at the time. East-West split. Of course, one of the causes of the Cold War was Germany being split up. Like the western part was occupied by the U.S., Britain, and France. That became West Germany. And then the eastern part, of course, was, occupied by the Soviets, which became East Germany. And, of course, Berlin was divided too, as you know, in the East and West Berlin. What was the Truman Doctrine? The term Iron Curtain. The term Iron Curtain was coined by Winston Churchill in the 1940s. Iron Curtain, of course, was a term that described how Eastern Europe was going communist in the 1950s. What was the Truman Doctrine? The Truman Doctrine was a U.S. policy under Harry S. Truman to contain the spread of communism. We wanted to prevent it from, spreading to other countries, because later in the 50s and 60s, they believed that there was the so-called domino theory that if one country fell to communism, they would go communist over time. Marshall Plan, also called the Economic Recovery Plan, was developed in the late 40s by Harry S. Truman and George C. Marshall, the Secretary of State. And the United States, of course, spent like $12-13 billion in aiding Western Europe to get back on their feet, and of course to prevent like World War III, because prevent basically communism from doing that. I guess World War III later. Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift, of course, was an incident where Stalin had blockaded Berlin between 1948 and 49. Stalin wanted to take over West Berlin. So the Allies in the West, like Britain, France, et cetera, and U.S., all basically did an airlift to aid basically West Berlin. And it saved West Berlin from falling to the Eastern Bloc. And so it led to the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And NATO was an alliance set up to counter the Soviet Union and the communist states in Eastern Europe. Of course, the Soviets developed the Warsaw Pact, which unified all the communist countries in Eastern Europe. The Fair Deal was a policy and program that Truman ran on, which was kind of like a combination of basically the, it was a combination of what is like the New Deal program, which he kind of restored again at that point. Who did Truman run against in 1948? John Dewey, I think was in New York. And of course, he beat him in a very close election, which most thought Dewey would win, but Truman won in an upset, of course, which was even seen in newspapers. Then they had the Second Red Scare. Second Red Scare, of course, was where they had a obsession with communism. They thought communism was going to take over the country in the United States, the late 40s and 1950s. And they had all kinds of things happen, like the Alger Hiss trial was a very famous event that happened in the Second Red Scare, where they thought Alger Hiss was a communist in the Secretary of State's office. HUAC, of course, was the House of Un-American Anti-American Activities, which was founded. That was a famous committee that basically investigated people for communism. McCarthyism, of course, was where Joseph McCarthy, senator of Wisconsin, investigated people for communism. Then the Rosenbergs, of course, were these Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were famous for supposedly giving U.S. secrets to the Soviet Union, and they were later executed for it. Also, we talked about the Russians got the atomic bomb, and they also got the hydrogen bomb in 1952. Fear of communism, we did that too. We talked about the fact that basically in China, People's Republic of China formed in 1949. It was founded by Mao Zedong. We had that, where China's going communist, and then North Korea went communist too under Kim Il-sung, which was backed by the Soviets and the Chinese. And the development of North Korea eventually in South Korea led eventually to the Korean War, which broke out in 1950 and 1953. And of course, that war would, of course, last around 3 years. It was considered one of the first major hot wars that was fought, or proxy war, which was fought in the Cold War. What happened was the United Nations intervened, and most of the United States got involved. And General Douglas MacArthur came in, and he, of course, took command, and he was able to invade Western South Korea at Incheon. They retook Seoul, the capital of South Korea. However, when they drove up into North Korea, the Chinese entered the war. It helped stalemate it, and neither side really won the war. The war is famous for MacArthur being fired by Truman. I think I told you about that last week. But President Eisenhower would be the one that actually would, officially end the war. And I already talked about, Eisenhower's administration right here. I'm probably going to pretty much probably skip that. I probably won't review that right now. But I'll go ahead and continue talking about Eisenhower right now. You already did all that today. You can get that from this lecture today. But let me talk about a few more things about Eisenhower. And then I need to go ahead and move on to try to get into like the 1960s a little bit today. With the space race thing going on at this point, Khrushchev at first tried to give the West an ultimatum, which he would do like multiple times. And he really wanted to get the Americans out of West Berlin, but the Western powers, I think at first didn't take him seriously at that point. So he refused. So he kind of backed down for a short time. And then they think what happened was Nikita Khrushchev, 1959, tried to smooth the differences over between Eisenhower and, of course, the Khrushchev administration and Soviet Union. And so Khrushchev decided he was going to go and visit the United States, which he did. In what is, I think it was in September of 1959, he came to the United States, visited for almost 2 weeks, where he met with Eisenhower. And then if you know what happened, he toured like the United States, like going all over the United States, and kind of gave a little tour of the country. And it was a big media circus, when Khrushchev came here. And Khrushchev is kind of a buffoon. I don't know if you know much about that. Definitely a buffoon. Kind of like this, he's almost like a guy that came off a farm, that kind of thing. In fact, one of the big things he wanted to do is he wanted to tour a bunch of farms and stuff. And they did that and all of that. And I think the only thing he was kind of miffed about was Khrushchev wanted to go visit Disneyland. And they said no. So anyway, then there's this other incident I usually like to talk about, which is very interesting about what happened. If you know what happened, Richard Nixon, he went to also Russia, like Soviet Union, and he actually met with Khrushchev. And I don't know if they were at this thing called the American National Exhibition in Moscow. It happened in July of 1959. The two got into a debate about the differences between capitalism and communism. And it became a big argument between the two. And that's something that kind of created a lot of tensions, between us and them and all that. So that didn't help either. And we were planning to go ahead and we were going to meet with Khrushchev at some kind of summit, some kind of diplomatic summit to kind of settle issues. But what happened was there was an incident in May of 1960 you may have heard of, called the U-2 incident that occurred, where basically the Soviet Union shot down U.S. spy plane. A U-2 is like a type of spy plane that was built by, I think, Lockheed Martin, I believe is correct. And anyway, what happened was the pilot, they thought the pilot was dead. He wasn't. He was captured, which was Francis Gary Powers, who actually worked for the CIA, by the way. And so what happened was the United States got caught spying on the Soviet Union. So it was really kind of an embarrassing thing that occurred with that. And so the U-2 incident, if you know much about it, it helped to kind of create a lot of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, which would continue into the 1960s. Because at that point, it looked like things were going to get better. Then these incidents started happening, and it really basically caused a lot of problems to actually occur. Now, going back to Eisenhower, before I move on, was famous for a few other things that I did want to mention briefly about him. Like they said, he's the guy that's the father of the federal interstate highway system. If you know much about it, Eisenhower, when he went into Europe and invaded Germany, he discovered the Autobahn, which Hitler had built. And so he got this idea to create the interstate highway system. That's what led to it. That was part of the so-called Federal Aid Highway Act. That's like one of his big things he did in the late 50s. And it would take a while, but they started building interstates, all over the United States. That's why they have I-10 and I-12 because of that act right there. Then in the video, they talked about the other thing. He's the one that started desegregating all the schools and allowing, black and white children to go to school together. And one of the first schools that was desegregated in the South, about it, was actually called Central High School in Little Rock. They call it Little Rock High or something like that, but originally it was called Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. And as you know, he had to use the military to basically desegregate because the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, refused to integrate it. And so he brought in the 101st Airborne Division, if you know about it, the Screaming Eagles, I think they called them. Anyway, they basically were brought in, and 9 African-American students were allowed to attend that first year in 1957. They were called the Little Rock Nine. You may have heard of them that basically did that. Also, one more thing that Eisenhower had happen under him, also Alaska and Hawaii were admitted, as states pretty much under his administration. So we now have 50 states, pretty much by 1959. So Ike did a lot of things. He was a pretty good president, but he played a lot of golf, that kind of like Trump, playing golf a lot. He was known for that as well. Like he had a putting green that he put. He was so obsessed with it. All right, moving on. Of course, I want to get into next, of course, today, and start talking about the 1960s. That's something we need to get into, of course. And the first thing I'm going to really talk about today, of course, is I want to get into talk about the presidential election of 1960. That's really the first thing that happens in the 60s. That's real big. And in the 60s, of course, you had basically the 1960 presidential election. You had 2 young guys, really young guys running for office, very energetic. You had Richard Nixon on one side, of course, Republican, that had been the vice president under Eisenhower for like 8 years. He ran on one side. And then you had also John F. Kennedy that you also have, who was from Massachusetts. He was Democratic senator. He was a war hero. You heard the story about PT 109 and all of that. And so both those candidates ran for president, of course, of the United States. And talk about the election a little bit, which is kind of famous, by the way, in American history. If you know much about it, it was one of the first televised elections where they had like debates, like on TV. I think they only had 2 for this election, I know, in 2020, but I think they had 4 debates that they had with each other. And so both used television, the news media, to try to put their message across to try to get elected and all that. And so these debates were pretty famous. I think as much as like something like 70 million people at one point may have actually watched the debates. I think all of them, I guess overall, pretty much. And you can see the two main issues they brought up were the economy and, of course, military defense, of course, to protect the United States, I guess, from threat of communism, like Soviet Union at that point. One big thing they brought up, I know, in like a lot of the debates, they kept talking about the missile gap, that we've got a missile gap between us and the Soviet Union and all of that. And actually, it wasn't true. It actually turned out to be false. There wasn't a missile gap. But Kennedy kind of explored that idea. And I think it helped him kind of get elected a little bit, Kennedy. Here's, of course, a picture of John F. Kennedy right here. And overall, if you study about the debates, it's interesting. But the debates, Kennedy proved to be the one that looked better. He was a better-looking man. I think a lot of women, like, if you know at Kennedy, he had a lot of women on the side. They think he had a lot of mistresses, apparently, like Marilyn Monroe and all that they say. And so he looked better looking than Nixon. Nixon, I think, was maybe the better debater, I think, overall. I think Nixon was smarter than Kennedy. Nixon was pretty smart. But Nixon looked kind of like, in some cases, unshaven. I know one debate looked like he didn't shave. He looked kind of overweight. And so appearance kind of obviously is something that really helped Kennedy a lot in winning. Kennedy, of course, was helped by the fact that his father was really wealthy, Joseph P. Kennedy. If you know much about that. But they think that Kennedy was actually backed by the American mafia, especially like in Illinois and all of that, in maybe New York. He picked Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a senator from Texas, who was a really powerful man in the South, probably one of the most powerful senators in the South at the time. And that helped him also cement a lot of the southern states and get elected. If you know much about the 1960 election, it's one of the closest elections in American history. The popular vote, look at that. It was only like 100,000 votes apart. It's kind of like the election now, like between Trump and Biden. It's like, I think it's about not that much. It might even be still up in the air, because it's kind of a debate about what's going to happen with Pennsylvania. They might, I think some people have even withdrawn Pennsylvania from Biden, so it's kind of going to be interesting to see what happens with that, because he's not leading by much. I think he's only got 279, so if it drops to 259 or something like that, who knows what might happen. But the electoral votes with Kennedy and Nixon wasn't as close. It's like 303 to 219, there's a kind of, they think that maybe the mafia may have helped Kennedy, if you know about this. There's been, I was talking about all this, they think all this fraud that may have happened in this election now. Well, in this election, they think they had a bunch of dead people votes in Illinois, which the mafia was behind. They think that may have helped basically get him elected. Because, Kennedy was the first Catholic president to be, elected. And I guess if Biden eventually, he's, officially elected, I guess, or becomes officially elected after they get the Electoral College together, he'll be the second Catholic president. So we'll see about that. All right. Now let's get into and talk about Kennedy more. Kennedy was famous for his inaugural address. That was one of the first things that he did when he came in, if you know about it. He was sworn in January of 1961, becoming the 35th president of the United States. He talked about his New Frontier program ideas that he had, and he talked about passing the torch, if you know about this, to a newer generation. And he said, "My fellow Americans, not ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." That was his famous quote that he was kind of known for. And one of the first things that Kennedy did when he came in, if you know about it, was he began to expand the space program. Because if you know about Kennedy in that inaugural address, he talked about putting a man on the moon, I think, which shocked a lot of people. I guess it put NASA on its place there in a spot. But I guess they eventually would do it by 1969. And so that was one of the things he did. And so eventually, under Kennedy, they started developing what they call the Gemini Program, which actually put 2 astronauts in space at the same time. Which they so far I think under the Mercury program they were just doing one at a time. Basically, the Gemini program was kind of this bridge between the Mercury program and the Apollo program. He also promised civil rights legislation. That's one thing that's famous about Kennedy. He started doing that a lot, and trying to get equal rights for African Americans, like trying to end segregation in the South, working to get voting rights as well for them as well in the South. And that's something he kind of starts doing, but he isn't as successful with it because he's assassinated before he can do anything. And Lyndon B Johnson will later do all that, when he comes in after. But it's something he starts to work on, and I'll get to it later more. I'll have probably a lecture later on the civil rights movement, but not today. I'll get to that later in another lecture. And so, Kennedy wanted to eradicate poverty, which something Johnson would do. Lyndon Johnson, had the Great Society program that he had to try to end poverty in the country. And all of that. And he started working on that, but he really didn't get much done on it either because, he got assassinated and all that. That's really what Kennedy's famous for. He's famous for getting shot. It's true about that. More about the assassination later as well. Other things he did do, he expanded unemployment, welfare, and food stamp benefits, which you'll see more later under Lyndon Johnson. You may have heard of the Clean Air Act that came out under also Kennedy to give the federal government and the EPA more control over keeping clean air, pretty much, and less pollution. But you see there on the bottom, the thing that Kennedy did the most, which was probably the most, was the tax cuts. He did tax cuts and raised they had high taxes at that point, I think going back to the 50s. And that was one thing, his big thing he did domestically that really helped the country out because it kind of created an economic boom after that. If you read about it. All right, let's talk about other things. Now, also, the big thing that happened under Kennedy that was pretty big, foreign policy-wise, was this big problem that he had. Cuba and Soviet Union were some things that Kennedy had to deal with pretty much when he was in power, like the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Berlin Wall got constructed, of course, in Germany. Then the Cuban Missile Crisis that also happened as well. And if you know about Cuba, of course, got taken over by Fidel Castro. Who was Fidel Castro? Castro was this Cuban revolutionary and Marxist who turned out to be a communist or became a communist. And he eventually overthrew the right-wing dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, who, by the way, we had backed for years in United States. And they had what they call the Cuban Revolution. And the Cuban Revolution, which lasted around 6 years or so, eventually overthrew Batista, and Castro took over. He took over Cuba, and he began to create kind of a communist state there, which shocked a lot of people, of course, in the United States when this happened, because Cuba's not that far from Florida. It's right offshore. Castro, by the way, in the Cuban Revolution was some guys are involved in it, of course, where his brother was involved, who's now in power now, Raul, heard of him, Castro. And also you may have heard of Che Guevara. He was involved too in the Cuban Revolution. He was from Argentina. And they were all involved in this movement that was called the 26th of July movement. And they turned out to be eventually communists, Marxist, Leninists, and all that. So this angers the United States. At first, we didn't know who he was, Castro, but when Castro came to the United Nations and started making speeches, we realized that he was a communist. And so this really infuriated the United States at this point. We were really kind of worried that what's going to happen is, of course, that Castro, we won't be able to get rid of him. He's just going to be right there where Cuba is. And so the CIA starts trying to plot under Eisenhower, I think around 1959, to try to remove Castro. And so what happens when Kennedy comes in as president, they basically decide to do this invasion that's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was this attempted coup where they were going to back some anti-Castro Cubans that were going to basically be trained and they were going to invade. They thought all the Cuban people would support it and overthrow Castro. And so the CIA started training all these anti-Castro Cubans in Florida, Guatemala, and they were either called La Brigada or they were called the Brigade 2506. Well, the operation, Bay of Pigs invasion, occurred in April of 1961, and it failed. It failed miserably. And I think about 1,200 of the men of the brigade were captured. The rest were killed and wounded. And so it all cemented Castro as a big hero in Cuba. It made us look like buffoons because we couldn't do it. And so the whole operation was a total embarrassment for Kennedy. It's like it's one of the first foreign policy things that's a blunder that he does, that he came in. And what's interesting about Kennedy, Kennedy actually took the full blame for it, for basically trying to oust Castro and all that. And he said that victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan, is what, of course, he said about the whole issue. And what's funny is the CIA kept trying to take out Castro. You may have heard of what they call Operation Mongoose. And Operation Mongoose was these CIA plots that seemed like something out of James Bond, where they tried to keep trying to assassinate Castro, like using exploding cigars. And they had this one thing they were going to do where Castro liked to go sea diving. They were going to put like poison in his scuba gear or something crazy. They tried all kinds of attempts. I forget how many times they tried to kill him, 30, 40 times, and they never could kill Castro. So it's kind of a weird story about that. So anyway, that's basically what the whole, thing was. Then, of course, the other big thing that happened under Kennedy was about the Berlin Wall, if you know much about it. And what happened was in 1961, East Germany and Soviet Union decided to build the Berlin Wall, which would encircle West Berlin, like to cut it off from the outside world. And so they began the construction of it. And it actually almost created World War III. It actually caused basically what they call the Berlin crisis at that point. And you can see in that picture there that basically that's around 61 you're looking at. I think that's correct. They start facing off each other, 61, 62, I think pretty much, facing off with tanks. Near like Checkpoint Charlie, you can see there. They got tanks facing each other. We got our tanks right there, American tanks. And then you can see across there on the other side where the Soviet side is in East Berlin, they got their tanks over there. And so we could have had, World War III break out at that point, And over time, after they build the Berlin Wall becomes a major symbol of the Cold War. I guess the tyranny of it and all that, which will later be torn down by 1990. And a lot of people died trying to cross, to go from East Berlin to West Berlin and all that. And if you know the story about this, Kennedy eventually came to West Berlin in 1963, and he gave his famous speech, his West Berlin speech he did, which was on June 26, 1963, asking about the West Berlin, and he basically it was an important speech he gave because he basically supported West Germany, and he was famous for giving a famous quote in the speech, which was "Ich bin ein Berliner," which means "I am a Berliner," was what the quote meant. And so it was considered to be one of the greatest speeches ever given during the Cold War era. It pretty much cemented U.S. support for West Germany, considered one of the greatest anti-communist speeches ever given overall. So Kennedy was a great guy, but like I said, we'll get to it later. He wasn't in office long because he would end up getting assassinated later. There is an urban legend that Kennedy supposedly said, "I'm a jelly donut," when he said Berliner, because a Berliner is a type of German jelly donut that's known, but they think that's now like a urban legend. It's not really true. So one more thing I've got time for today to talk a few minutes about. Now, also what happened too, which was the peak of the Cold War, was they had the Cuban Missile Crisis occur. What happened was in October of 1962, the United States discovered the Soviet Union, of course, had put missiles in Cuba, probably nuclear missiles. We found this out, by the way, because of U-2 spy planes that were flying over, Cuba. And so it's believed that the Soviets put these in Cuba so that we wouldn't invade. Because we tried to, invade 1961. And so what's going to happen eventually is going to lead to a conflict, which I'll get to later, where there's going to be this blockade of Cuba that they're going to do with the U.S. Navy with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's going to last about a month and about, I think, 4 days was how long it actually lasted. I think that's correct. Yeah, about a month and 4 days. And it got so bad that the controversy even spilled over into the United Nations Assembly, where Adlai Stevenson, if you know about it, was the U.S. ambassador to the UN. And he got into this big confrontation with the Soviet ambassador, Valerian Zorin. I do have a little video on that I'll show you, which is very interesting, which I do have. Let me bring it up and I'll show you, but it's very, very famous.
Havana, early 1962. Castro's government has invasion jitters. It is whispered Kennedy has asked the Soviets to keep hands off should the United States invade Cuba. That Kennedy has promised anti-Castro Cubans the support of 6 United States divisions. Castro pleads with Khrushchev. He says an invasion is coming. Up to now, the Kremlin has turned a deaf ear. Now, Castro's needs coincide with Khrushchev's. On Cuban TV, Castro denounces the blockade.
Everything has been a total fiasco for the Americans. Now they attempt to prevent us from defending ourselves. They expect us not to look for help from the socialist camp. That is imperialism.
Now the showdown has begun. For the first time, the cities of the United States and the people who live in them are vulnerable if war comes.
I should like to say...
Sir, would you please continue your statement? You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
Hell freezes over. So anyway, that's a famous, what happened in the UN with that. Now, what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis? Of course, I could finish that up real quick. Well, yeah, like I said, the United States blockaded it. If you think about it, and let me go to the slide I want to put up there for you. Where is it? Right here. If you have the sites, of course, right there. There, of course, is where the Cuban missiles were, right there with them U-2, of course, and the U-2 spy planes that had gone over at that point. And anyway, what happened was that we put a blockade on them, and so. Put that up on the screen. I had it up there earlier, right there. There it is, right there. But the blockade would last that long. And what happened was Khrushchev eventually backed down. He blinked, I guess, is what basically occurred. And so basically, one of the things that, of course, occurred was that we made this deal with the Soviets that they would basically, if they would remove their missiles, we would actually remove ours in Turkey, because we had some missiles in Turkey that were pointed at the Soviet Union. And so the reason why the whole, Cuban Missile Crisis is so important is because it was considered the peak of the Cold War. Things got better after that, a little bit, but that was the closest we probably ever got to actually World War III overall. That's what led to Moscow and Washington, D.C. developing a hotline, if you know about that, between Moscow and Washington to help prevent any kind of crisis or something that might, create nuclear war and all that. And you see them maybe in movies or something. They always talk about the red phone. I got the red phone, and stuff like that. But there is no red phone in the White House. This is something that I think movies made up and all that. I don't even use a phone.